Rally across the region after the gains. We saw Wall Street, so the Nikkei 225 higher by 1.5%. The Seoul Kospi gaining by 1.5%, and the ASX 200 index also at this point advancing by 1.25%. Now we got some recommendations from the Asian Development Bank this morning, warning that regional economies may have to ease policy even further because of the global slowdown. So the ADB is blaming the EU debt problems, of course, for declining exports across the Asia Pacific. And just last week, we had the ADB cutting its 2012 growth forecast for Asia down to 6.6%, down from the 6.9% that the ADB had forecast back in April. Now let's take a closer look at the recommendations. And joining us this morning from Singapore, Iwan Azis, the head of regional integration at the ADB. Iwan, good to have you in the program. So let's stand by and talk about these recommendations that the ADB says that Asia must stand ready to unleash monetary and fiscal power all across the board, or are there more economies at risk?
Yeah, one has to remember that the so-called double-track growth is still happening in the world, where the growth in industrial countries has been slowing down, whereas the growth in emerging Asia are still relatively strong, despite the fact, as you just said earlier, declining from what we forecast earlier.
Okay, so when you say emerging Asia, I assume that also includes China, which most people are expecting more stimulus to come from.
Correct. Well, in the case of China, we all know in 2008, 2009, they conducted a massive stimulus package, both through the fiscal as well as through the banking sector. And I know there's a lot of discussions about China's strategy in the coming years should not focus on investment, rather on consumption and so forth. I think China should be careful in the sense that they cannot just stop doing the investment and just focusing on consumption. You need to continue investing. The difference is, I think, is what kind of investment. I think what China needs is really more and more investment in infrastructure, including infrastructure in the soft side, social infrastructure. So it's not just a choice, either consumption or investment. They still need the investment.
Okay, well, let me ask you about the steps taken so far, because China cut interest rates twice in a month's time. The Bank of Korea also surprising the market. But in your view, are basically the economies and the central banks across the Asia Pacific right now really behind the curve?
Not necessarily too much behind the curve, maybe just a few months behind the curve. See, we have to keep in mind that the world economy, especially in the financial sector, these days are highly volatile. No one can make any predictions, I mean, look what happened with the stock market and then bonds market, and now we have a bearing scandal and so forth. Even the banking sector, it's getting more and more difficult to predict. So it's getting more difficult or almost impossible to say whether monetary authority in one country is behind the curve or not. I think what is more important for those policymakers now is really to keep an eye very carefully about the movement of all these variables and then react accordingly.
Okay, well, Iwan, the ADB basically says a prolonged period of weak growth and financial fragility, let me say that right, in advanced economies highlight the urgent need for this, basically this unleashing of monetary and fiscal stimulus. So are you saying that the ADB has priced in, say, a double dip in the U.S. or a worse than expected recession in the Eurozone?
Well, recession in Eurozone, it's happening. But in the U.S., the probability is still, like a few months ago. It's 50-50. But I think the latest statement made by Ben Bernanke is pretty clear that indicators like unemployment, traditionally unemployment is like, lagging indicators. But now it's more and more unemployment becoming a leading indicator, which means that market can start to also predict what happened in the U.S. economy, given the fact that the unemployment situation is quite dire.
Okay, so Iwan, you factored in a recession, a deep one maybe, in the Eurozone, but have you factored in a breakup of the Euro this year?
That is a hard question. I think if just based on what I hear and what I read, I think the politicians in Europe is quite unified in terms of trying to keep the euro intact. But the question here is really what is the most effective action that they can do to prevent the breakup from happening. So, despite all this, it's hard to not to assume that the recession is happening in Europe, and that has implication on Asia, because as you know, a number of the East Asian countries are so much export dependent, and that will translate into bad news for those countries.
Okay, Iwan, thank you so much for your time today. Good seeing you there. Iwan
Pleasure.
Azis, Head of Regional Integration at the Asian Development Bank, joining us from Singapore.